Homesteading family. And so many of you guys asked me to do a video on canning whole cherries in cider that I thought I'd go ahead and take a few moments here and on my first batch of cherries this morning, go ahead and show you how to can cherries in apple cider. Now, it's already July, and because we had kind of a late spring that went kind of long, we are now all of a sudden seeing everything starting to ripen all at the same time. And so we really need to be right on doing big batches of canning up here this year, especially since my belly's growing too. And we don't have too many more months before we have a new baby. And I know that I am gonna start slowing down. My energy's gonna drop, and I'm gonna have a little less ability to just can all day. So I'm trying to get as much done as I can. So we've got lots of cherries coming into the house. Here's one bowl, there's another bowl the same size back there, and the kids are right now out picking even more cherries off the trees. So these are a sweet cherry that I have here. They do look a lot like the sour cherries you can get, but they aren't. They are a sweet cherry, and they have been picked through and destemmed, but I have not pitted these. Now, we really like these non-pitted for eating fresh in the winter. Of course, if you wanted to add them to something, like make a cherry pie out of them or anything like that, you would probably want to pit these before you went ahead and canned them. And you can completely do that with this. It doesn't change any part of this besides you just need to start with pitted cherries. I pit the cherries that I make cherry pie filling out of, but for this we just use this for fresh eating, and you know, the kids love spitting out the cherry pits, so that's just fine with us in our house. And it means that I can get a lot more cherries up, because pitting your fruit or having to peel it or doing any of the special preparation with it really slows down the process. And this is one of the reasons why I just love doing cherries in this way, is because it's so fast. Now, when I start canning, I always do a few things. One is I get out my jars and I get them washed in nice hot soapy water. And of course that cleans the jars, but it also warms them. So I start with warm jars. Now, the recommendations used to be that you needed to sterilize your jars in boiling water, and they have reversed those recommendations now as long as you're canning for over 10 minutes. And really, I don't think I've ever seen a recommended canning recipe for under 10 minutes. So because of that, you do not need to sterilize your jars. Now, you want warm jars for the only reason, not because of a cleanliness issue or anything like that, but because you don't want your jars to experience thermal shocks. You don't want cold jars, is what that means, because you're going to put something warm into them, and then you're going to put them into boiling water, and you know, that glass, the expansion of the glass there can make it crack and break if it's not warm. So you can have warm jars, and you know, you don't need to work like crazy fast and pull one jar out of the oven or out of hot water and fill it up real fast. It's really not that time sensitive. The real important factor here is just not to have cold jars. So we've got, our jars are still a little bit warm to the touch here, but they're certainly not cold. And so those are the first things I take care of. The next thing I take care of is I get my canner going. And so right now, my water bath canner is outside where I can, and it is filled with water, and it is warming up to a gentle simmer, and it'll just sit there and wait for me out on the camp stove where I like to can. It just makes the kitchen way too hot to can in the house all day long, especially when you're doing batch after batch after batch. And I still have to cook for the family and make sure that they have meals even on a crazy canning day. And sometimes that means heating something up on the stove. So the canner is going. Now, the other thing that I get going right away at the beginning is to make sure that I've got my lids getting warmed up for my jars. So here I just have a small pot, and it has some clean water in it. And I know that I'm gonna do about 7 jars, because that's what's gonna fit in my canner. And so I'm gonna just go ahead and drop 7 of the flat canning jars right in here. Now, I always do an extra one just because, and that's fine because all you're doing is heating them and cooling them. So that doesn't ruin this. You can use it again if not. So I always just tossed an extra one in there in case I drop one on the floor or I miscounted or something. Now you don't technically need to warm these, but I always do just so that all of my pieces are in the same place. So I just drop them right in the pot. And I'm gonna take this over to the regular kitchen stove and I'm gonna turn it on to low with the lid on. I'm gonna bring it up to a gentle simmer and then I'm just gonna leave the pot on and turn the whole thing off so that it can just sit and warm. And all this is doing is it is softening the rubber part right here around your lid so that it will form a better seal to your jar. Again, we're not worried about having things sterilized because we're gonna can this for well over 10 minutes. Okay, now before I actually get into the canning process, I double check to make sure that I have all of my materials on hand. I already checked my jars and they're all clean and checked for nicks. I made sure, you know, a lot of my jars are really old. They've been gifted to me from neighbors who have been canning for many decades. And so I always have to check that I don't have any nicks, and I do this just by running my finger around the edge and just feeling for anything that doesn't feel nice and smooth on the top. I'm also checking to make sure at this point that I have all of my equipment out because it's no fun to be like, oh, I need my lid lifter. Where's my lid lifter? And that's one thing that I will not can without. This is my magic wand lid lifter, and it's just a little stick with a magnet at the end so that when those very hot lids are all ready and I'm ready to put them on my jars, I can just stick this in here and pull it right out and get it right onto my lid there, onto my jar. Without burning my fingers. I've tried it when I've lost my lid lifter. I have tried it with tongs and with chopsticks and with everything else, and you always burn your fingers and it's no fun. So I make sure this is on hand. I make sure I've got my good ladle ready to go, and always, again, make sure you have your jar lifter. You've got to have one of these, really. I have tried other things when I've had one of these break when I didn't have a backup on hand, and it never goes well. It is always a disaster. So spend the $3, $4, $5 it takes to get yourself a lid lifter. Okay, now for the juice that I'm going to use today, I have our home canned apple cider, and we have this wonderful apple cider mill down the road that's run by a Mennonite family, and you can take all your apples down there off your own trees and press them, and it costs a few cents a gallon. It is under $1 a gallon to go ahead and get your apples crushed and the juice extracted, and it's such a fun event for everybody. Everybody loves doing it. So we do many gallons every year, and then I put up a whole bunch, and some of it gets turned into hot apple cider during the winter for the kids when they come in from playing in the snow. And others, though, get specifically stashed just for my next canning year, because I would really rather can in juice than in any sort of a syrup, because that just has so much refined sugar, and you know, it doesn't do that much for the flavor. But boy, this apple cider just really brings out the flavor in those cherries. It makes it so good, and I feel so much better about serving it to my children as a healthy snack. And instead of, you know, I would always kind of have a reservation about giving them something canned in syrup, in a sugar syrup. So, so I have my cider here ready to go, and all I'm going to do is pop these guys open, and I'm going to pour it right into this pot that I have. You can see that this is unfiltered, so this is the real stuff. It's got all the good stuff in the bottom still. And you know what? I'm just going to put it right in. You could certainly filter that out. Now, what if you don't have your own apple cider? What should you do? Apple juice from the store would be just fine. You can go buy big things, gallon jars of organic apple cider, and they're actually not that expensive. Just set these guys out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and get this heating on to high, because I want to bring this up to a simmer. I want this to go all the way up to a simmer. Now, I'm going to show you how easy this is, guys. If you are nervous about canning, this is such a great project to start with. I have my cherries. They, like I said, they've been destemmed. They have not been pitted. They have been washed if necessary. They came right off of our own organic non-sprayed trees. So I often don't wash them. But, you know, if you have sprayed cherries or you know, they're getting sticky or unpleasant to handle, go right ahead and wash them. And this is all I do. You just put the cherries in the jar. I didn't have to heat the cherries. I didn't do anything to them. This is called a raw pack because you're putting the fruit in raw and uncooked and non-heated. The liquid going over them is going to be boiling and hot. But you know, that's pretty simple too. All you're doing is heating some juice, and that's a pretty simple canning project if you need to start with something. All right, the cider has come to a gentle simmer right here. And I did go ahead and stir that a few times while it was coming up to temperature because this is a very thin bottomed pot and I didn't want any scorching on the bottom. If you're working with a thick bottom pot, you're probably okay just to let it come up without any stirring, but you can always give it a stir or two in the process. My lids are ready. They came to a gentle simmer and they have now been sitting for about 10 minutes in the warm water, the hot water with the lid on. And I just checked my canning pot and it has just come up to a gentle simmer. So we're all ready to go. Now you can see I went ahead and filled all of the jars and it just took about a minute. And I went ahead and pushed these guys in a little bit as I did it to really make sure that I got the cherries packed in there really well. I didn't want to squish them, so I didn't, you know, push them to the point where they were gonna squish, but I went ahead and kind of gave them a good press, firm press down while still trying to keep them a little bit underneath the rim here of the jar. So we're going to go ahead and start filling these with the hot apple cider. But before we do so, we need to talk about headspace. And if you have canned before, you'll know how important getting the correct headspace is. It can make the difference between having a jar that seals properly and one that doesn't. And the reason is that if you overfill this jar with liquid, different jars and different products will boil out at a different rate, and it will come out of your jars in the canning process if you overfill it, and it will get junk and little bits of sticky and juice under where your lid is supposed to be sealing. And that will prevent your jars from sealing properly and you'll end up with a seal failure. So you don't want to do that. It can also, overfilled jars can be very unsightly and it makes your water bath canner very sticky. And so then even if you don't lose your seal and you have well sealed product at the end, you'll end up really having to wash each of your jars. If you get your headspace correct, you should have the water come in your canner be just as clean when you're done as when you started. So we want to go ahead and follow the guidelines for the headspace. For fruit and juice, it is 1/2 inch. And you know, I am notoriously bad for not being able to measure things or eyeball things. I just can't. I can't see any measurement at all. So you can get yourself one of these things. It's really just a ruler that tells you how much, and you can say, oh, I'm supposed to have 1/2 inch, and you can set it on the 1/2 inch step and see right where you're supposed to fill it to. But for myself, I've learned that for 1/2 inch is really somewhere just over the bottom large lip of the neck of the jar here. And so as long as you get it right up in that area, you'll be close enough and you'll be just fine. Now this part is pretty simple. It's all pretty simple. This is really easy, guys. You can do this. This is just no problem at all. The hardest part of all of this is obtaining the cherries, honestly. Once you can find cherries, boy, you are good to go. So I'm just gonna ladle this in, being careful not to spill on myself because this is very hot. And you can see this is filling right up, because this is not a thick product, it's just whole uncooked fruit, this just fills right up. There won't be air pockets, won't be a problem there. So when you go to use these guys, don't forget about the juice. The juice is now going to be cherry infused apple cider. I mean, when you say it that way, it sounds like a gourmet treat all by itself. And oh, we just love that. If we're not gonna drink it right off or use it as a base for a drink, like a secondary ferment on a kombucha, then we save it and we bake with it. Baked oatmeal made with a base of cherry infused apple cider is absolutely delicious. It is so nice on a cold winter morning to have some of that in your bowl. We really like it. Now you can see this is a pretty fast process, and if you're using your funnel correctly, you should be able to keep the whole thing rather neat and tidy. You know, myself, if I can make a mess out of it, I often do. So I make sure I've got some very clean kitchen towels or rags on hand to kind of clean up right away after myself. Okay, now one other thing that I like to do with this, and this is completely optional for you, is I like to add just a touch of almond extract to each jar. You could go ahead and do it in the juice, but I feel like by bringing that to a simmer, I feel like you lose some of the good qualities of it. So I go ahead and afterwards, and I probably just put about a 1/4 teaspoon of some almond extract in each jar. And again, this is totally optional. Because your extracts are preserved in alcohol, it is not going to affect the preservability of your fruit at all. So you can add as much or as little as you'd like. One year I felt really decadent and I did vanilla and almond, and oh, that was really good. So you can kind of play with your extracts a little bit and get them in there. Okay, now I have this done, and I'm just gonna set my funnel aside and set my cider aside. And I am on to putting my lids on. Now I have my warm water here. It's actually quite hot still. And I have a very, very clean kitchen towel. And I like to just dip the corner, a little bit of the towel right on into that hot water, and then use that to just clean off any juice, any little bits of spills that I might have on my rims. And then I go ahead and use a dry spot of the towel to go ahead and just dry them each. And then just to be extra sure, because you know I have lost jars, the seals have not sealed properly because I have not been very meticulous about keeping this part, you know, totally clean. So I always take my clean dry finger and I just feel around the edge, double checking for nicks and for any stickiness or any bumps of food or anything that I did not just get cleaned off. And these feel great, so I am good to go. And I'm gonna get out my magic wand and I'm gonna start just pulling out my lids and popping them right on. Now, these lids, the instant they come out of the water, they're not hot anymore. So you can really grab them right away. And this makes it so easy. This is so much easier than using a, you know, trying to get things out with tongs or what have you. I've got a couple lids there stuck together. So, go ahead now. You do have to be careful of the boiling water that's stuck between the two of them. And then I'm just gonna pull my rings and go ahead and just get those on there for now. Now I only keep a few rings in the house at a time, just enough to do whatever my biggest canning day is, and then start the next day if I'm doing a few in a row. Because you don't need to store your canned goods with the rings on, and you know, you can just end up with a million rings. And some people like putting them back on their empty jars, but We use our jars throughout the year. I don't use Tupperware, I use my jars. And I'll recan them with beans in them during the winter or different things like that. We use them as drinking jars too. Okay, so we have the lids and the rings on all of them, and I'm going to set this out of the way here. Because I can outside, I have just a good turkey roasting heavy duty pan that I use to transport my jars. So as I set them in, I'm just going to give them a good tighten down. And this is just supposed to be finger tight. And what that means is just tighten it hand tight. You're not looking to just like wrench them on there. That can actually cause problems for you later. So just get them tightened on real nice, but not, you know, you don't need anybody super strong to come and do it for you or anything like that. Just give it a good tightening down. Look at how beautiful that is. Isn't that just amazing? I love that color. Now I'm going to take these outside and I am going to go ahead and use my jar lifter over here to pick up my jars just like that, and to set them very gently into my canner. I usually turn my canner off for a minute before I do that, just for a few seconds, just when I walk outside, because there's really no reason to be trying to put hot jars into actively boiling water. So I let that boil just die down for a second so it's not splashing and boiling over me. And then I'm going to put all of my jars in, turn the canner back on, make sure that the water is covering my jars. If it's not, I'll add a little bit more. And once that water comes up to a good steady boil, I don't mean going crazy to the moon boil, you don't want to overboil them, but it needs to be above a simmer and it needs to be actively boiling. Then I'm going to start my timer, and these are, if you live at sea level, these need to be canned for 25 minutes, whether you're working with pints or quarts. And as you go up in elevation, you need to increase your time. So you'll just have to find a chart for that. Any good canning book is going to have your elevation adjustment charts. Most good canning websites will have an elevation adjustment chart. And for me, I'm up at about 2,500 feet, so I'm going to have to can these for 30 minutes. So as soon as that boil comes back up to a full rolling boil, I'll go ahead and start my timer for 30 minutes. Once the timer goes off, I'll go ahead and turn the canner off and then go ahead and pull my jars out, and I will spread them back out on a towel. I actually have my outside table, and I'm going to make sure when I spread them back out, I'm going to leave just a little bit of space between them so that they can cool properly. And at that point, I tell everybody, don't look at them, don't touch them, don't clink them with anything else. Give them a full cool down, which usually I give them 24 hours. Usually 12 hours is plenty. But if you start banging them around before that rubber has had a chance to come all the way down, to cool back down, and to really form to the lid top, the jar top, then you can cause it to unseal. So we go ahead and just leave them alone for about 24 hours. Then you'll need to clean your jars if they're dirty. Take the rings back off and make sure you clean under there. If you keep rings on your jars, put them back on loosely. Don't tighten them down real hard. And or just keep your rings all the way off at that point, and make sure you label them. You'll want to know the difference between your cherry pie filling and your whole cherries and apple juice. And once you get them up on the counter or up on your shelf, they can look really quite the same. Guys, this has been a long video lesson. I hope that you have enjoyed it. Happy canning. This is a great project to start with if you've never canned before. And enjoy them, and your family will enjoy them too. Thank you. Hey, I know we have a lot of new viewers here. If you have enjoyed this video, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And if you can think of anybody else who might appreciate it, go ahead and hit the share button and send it to them. Help us get the word out that you can homestead wherever you are.